Al-Ghazali regarding the pole. Al-Ghazali says that heaven is a sphere rotating around two poles as though both are stationary. Now the heavenly sphere is of similar parts, for it is simple, particularly the highest heaven and the ninth has no stars at all. These two spheres, the ninth and the rest, rotate around two poles, northern and southern. Thus we say there are no two opposite points among the points that, according to you, the philosophers, are infinite, but could be conceived as being the pole. Why is it then that the northern and southern points have been assigned to the poles and to be stationary? And why does not the ecliptic line shift, moving with it the 2 points, so that the poles would revert to the two opposite points of the ecliptic? If then there is wisdom in the extent of the largeness of heaven and its shape, what differentiated the place of the pole from another place, singling it out to be the pole from the rest of the parts and points, when all the points are similar and all parts of the sphere are equal? There is no way out of this for you. The philosophers say, perhaps the position where the point of the pole lies differs from other positions by a peculiarity that renders it suitable to be a place for the pole, so as to be rendered stationary. Perhaps then that position for the pole has precedence over others for being stationary. Al-Ghazali says, in this there is a declared admission of a natural inequality of the parts of the first sphere, and that is not of similar parts. This is contrary to your principle, since one of the principles on which you base your proof for the necessity for the heavens to be spherical in shape is that it is a simple nature, similar in its parts, having no inequality. The simplest of the figures is a sphere. However, the question regarding that peculiarity remains, are the rest of the parts receptive of this peculiarity or not? If you say yes, then why did this peculiarity attach specifically to one of the similar and not the rest? The philosophers say this peculiarity does not belong to any but that position, the rest of the parts not being receptive of it. Al-Ghazali says, the rest of the parts, inasmuch as they constitute a body receptive of forms, are necessarily similar. The place is not deserving of that peculiarity by simply being a body or by simply being a heaven, for this intended meaning is shared by all parts of heaven. It is thus the inescapable conclusion that assigning a particular place for the specific characteristic is, number one, either arbitrary, or number two, realized through an attribute whose very function is to render one thing more specific than its exact similar. This is to show that just as it is legitimate for you to say that the temporal states are equal in their receptivity of the world's occurrence, it is also legitimate for your opponents to say that the parts of heaven are equal in terms of the receptivity of the idea due to which precedence is given to the fixity of one position for the pole as against its replacement. From this there is no escape. Al-Ghazali says, second is the direction of the motion of the spheres. What is the cause for assigning the direction of the motions of the spheres, some from east to west, some in the opposite direction? This despite the equivalence in direction, when the equivalence in direction is similar to the equivalence in times, there being no difference. The philosophers say, if all of the spheres were to rotate in one direction, then their positions will not differ, and the relationships between the stars in terms of being trine, sextile, having conjunction, and the like would not come about. The whole would then be in one state without any differentiation at all, when in fact these diverse relationships are the principles of temporal events in the world. Al-Ghazali says, we do not object to the difference in the direction of the movement. On the contrary, we say that the highest sphere moves from east to west, and what is beneath it in the opposite direction. Everything that can be achieved through this is achievable through its opposite, namely in that the higher would move from west to east, and that which is beneath it in the opposite direction, thereby differences taking place. Now the directions of the motion of the being circular and opposite are equivalent. Why then did one direction differ from another similar direction? The philosophers say the directions are opposite and contrary. How then are they similar? Al-Ghazali says, this is similar to someone saying that priority and posteriority in terms of the worlds coming into existence are contraries. How can one then claim their similarity? They claim, however, that one knows the similarity of times in relation to the possibility of existence and every beneficial end in existence whose conception is supposed. But then one can similarly claim that one knows the equivalence in space, position and direction with respect to the receptivity of motion and every beneficial end related to it. If then they are allowed the claim of difference despite the similarity, their opponents are also allowed the claim of difference in times and configurations. Al-Ghazali's second objection: you deem the occurrence of a temporal event through an eternal improbable when it is incumbent on you to acknowledge it, because in the world there are temporal events which have causes. If temporal events were to depend on other temporal events ad infinitum, this would be impossible. This is not the belief of a rational person. If this were possible, you would then have had no need to acknowledge the existence of the Maker and affirm a necessary existent who is the ground of all the possible existence. If events have a limit with which their chain terminates, then this limit would be the eternal. It is hence inescapable in terms of the philosopher's principle to allow the proceeding of a temporal form an eternal. The philosophers say, we do not deem improbable the proceeding of a temporal event, whichever event this is, from an eternal. Rather, we deem improbable the proceeding from an eternal event, which is a first event, because the state of coming into existence does not differ from what precedes it with respect to the preponderance of the direction of existence, whether in terms of the presence of a temporal moment, an organ, a condition, nature, purpose, or any cause. But if the event is not the first event, then it is possible for the temporal event to proceed from an eternal with the temporal occurrence of some other thing, such as preparedness in the receptacle, the presence of a suitable time, or something of this sort. Al-Ghazali says, the question regarding the occurrence of the preparedness, the presence of the suitable time, and whatever comes into being anew remains. Number 1, either these occurrences regress ad infinitum, or number 2, it terminates with an eternal from which a first temporal event comes about. The philosophers say, none of the materials receptive of forms, accidents, and qualities are temporally created. And number 2, the qualities that come into being in time are the movements of the spheres, that is the circular motion, and whatever descriptions relating to it by way of triadic, hexagonal, and quadratic configurations that come into existence anew. These consist of the relation of some parts of heaven and the stars to each other and some to the earth, as with the occurrences that take place by way of astral ascent, appearance in the firmament, the decline from the highest point and greatest distance from the earth by the stars being at its apogee, and its proximity by being at its perigee and inclining away from some climes by being in the north or in the south. This relation is by necessity a concomitant to the circular motion. It is hence necessitated by the circular motion as regards the events contained in the sublunary sphere, namely the elements with respect to what occurs in them by way of generation and corruption, combination and separation and transformation from one description to another. All these are events dependent on each other in a lengthy, detailed way. In the end, the principles of their causes terminate with the circular heavenly movement, the relations of the stars to each other, and their relation to the earth. The outcome of all this is that the perpetual eternal circular motion is the basis of all temporal events. That which imparts the circular motion of the heavens is the souls of the spheres, for these are alive, having the same relation to the spheres as our souls to our bodies. Number 4, the spheres' souls are eternal. No wonder then that the heavenly motion necessitated by the souls is also eternal. And since the states of the souls are similar, due to their being eternal, the states of the movements become similar, that is, they circulate eternally. It is hence inconceivable for a temporal event to proceed from an eternal except through the mediation of an eternal circular movement that in one respect resembles the eternal, for he is everlasting, and that in another respect resembles the temporal, for each of its parts that are supposed comes into existence after not being. Hence, inasmuch as the circular movement is temporal in terms of its parts and relationships, it is the principle of temporal events, and inasmuch as it is eternal of similar states, it proceeds from an eternal soul. Thus, if there are events in the world, there must then be a circular motion, but in the world there are events. Therefore, the eternal circular motion is established. Al-Ghazali says, this lengthy elaboration does you no good. The philosophers say, why? Al-Ghazali says, because is the circular motion, which is the foundation of all temporal events, temporally originated or eternal? If eternal, how does this foundation become a principle for the first temporal event? If temporal, it would require another temporal event, and so on, regressing and ad infinitum. The philosophers say, in one respect it resembles the eternal, and in another respect the temporal, being constant and renewed. That is, it is constant in being renewed, and its constancy is ever renewed. Al-Ghazali says, is it the principle of temporal events in as much as it is permanent, or in as much as it is being renewed? If in as much as it is permanent, how is it then that it would proceed from something permanent whose states are similar to something that occurs at certain times but not others? If in as much as it is renewed, what is the cause of the renewal in itself? It would then require another cause, and this would regress infinitely. This is the final word in confirming the necessary, absurd consequences of their position.